This is the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Welcome to the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Today I have with me Tamsin Grimmer, who is early years consultant, author and lecturer. Thank you for joining us today, Tamsin.
My pleasure.
So we're going to discuss the importance of physical touch. And just for like a little introduction, Tamsin, I know you do a lot of work on loving pedagogy. And what I've heard you talk and write about a lot is love languages. And this is often talked about in a more kind of romantic sense amongst adults. But actually, you explain that this is a vital part of loving pedagogy when working with children. So I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So for people that haven't heard of love languages, before, it's all about sort of tuning into children and listening to how they demonstrate love to other people. So it's the whole idea that people give and receive love in different ways. So it comes from some work that some guys called Chapman and Campbell have done around love languages. And like you say, they sort of started that work looking at relationships between adults, but they've extended it to look at sort of parents and their relationships with their children. And then in the US, they've also done some work on love languages in school. But I was really thinking about it in terms of our youngest children and thinking, well, how do our children demonstrate their love to us? And the idea is if a child, for example, has a love language of wanting to spend time with somebody, so quality time might be the way that they would, show love. Then if a practitioner doesn't have any time to spend with that child, the child might not feel loved. Another child might have a love language of words. They might need to hear somebody say, I love you, to feel loved. And so the practitioner could spend loads and loads of time with that child, but they might not feel loved because they haven't actually heard those words, I love you. So, or similar, So it's quite an interesting sort of concept, really, because it's highlighting that slight difference between feeling loved and being loved. And so you might be loved, but you might not necessarily feel it. So I was thinking, if we can just attune to our children and work out what their love languages are, then we can help our children to actually feel loved in their time with us.
So it's really tapping into that unique child, which we do talk a lot about, isn't it? Really understanding that we as adults may have a different way of wanting to be loved, and actually our children have different ways, and each child individually is attuned to different ways of receiving love and attention and care.
Yes. So Chapman and Campbell have identified five love languages. So they talk about words of affirmation. So not just saying I love you, it could be other affirming words as well. They talk about quality time. They talk about giving and receiving gifts. They also talk about acts of service, so doing things for people you love, or loving it when someone does things for you, and also touch, using positive touch or physical touch, as a way of expressing love as well. So those are the five that they kind of focus on. So those are the five that I tend to talk about as well. Your listeners might think of more. But yes.
And I think it would be interesting if we today on this episode focus a little bit more on physical touch, because I know that's something that some early years settings do almost struggle with, understanding how to appropriately show children love in that way, because there have been kind of issues around safeguarding and concerns and the kind of policies and procedures around that. But actually, if we go back to I know what I learned when I was doing a psychology degree actually is a 1950s studies on Harlow's monkeys that looked into newborn rhesus monkeys bonding with their mothers, and then it found that tactile comfort plays a huge role in attachment. So actually, looking further back and then probably studies even before that might have found things similar. What's your view on the importance of physical touch is it as important as the rest of the love languages in an earlier setting? Is it something that we need to be a little bit more kind of cautious or concerned about, as some practitioners are?
I can understand why practitioners might be cautious or concerned about it, but touch is vital. And, you've mentioned one sort of piece of research there, but there's so much research out there, and lots of really modern research as well that looks at the importance of touch. And there was one particular study that came out during the pandemic that said touch was as important to children and child development as healthy food, nutritional food.
Oh, wow.
So it's quite, I know, it hit the
really
Nursery World headlines. Absolutely. And so, we know about all the different chemicals and hormones that are released when we're lovingly touched. We have oxytocin, we have dopamines, we have serotonin, endorphins. So we have all of these lovely chemicals that kind of make us feel good. But actually, there's a chemical reaction when we're lovingly touched. But actually, it's about being social beings as well. And we know that children are social beings from birth, and they seek out social interaction with others. And part of that, I think, is about using touch and being lovingly touched as well. So I do think touch is incredibly important. And the thing with the love languages, although we may have a preferred way of showing love, actually we might speak several different love languages. And in my own practice, I've noticed that many children respond well to positive touch, and they're quite touchy-feely when they're young, if you see what I mean. So I think for a lot of our children, touch is an important part of their lives. So yeah, it's vital.
And I've heard someone recently on another podcast that isn't educational kind of talk about like the rich language of touch, of physical touch, which is really interesting, because we hear of rich vocabularies and rich language, but I guess tuning into ways in which children like to feel comforted and touched, and also again going back to like what is appropriate. So what would you say, what are ways in which educators can show physical touch to children?
So I mean, there are so many ways that we do it without even realizing we're doing it. So just on a daily basis, we might be using touch even to sort of guide a child along. We might gently touch their back as we're kind of moving them. We might hold their hand as we move from one place to another. We might tickle a child. We might offer them a high five to sort of praise them and say, hey, that was fantastic. So there are lots of sort of incidental ways that we often find we're using touch without really thinking about it. You can walk past a child and sort of gently ruffle their hair or squeeze their shoulder or something sometimes. But there will also be other ways that we'll kind of, sometimes we'll be thinking about how we're using touch. And I think times when it's a bit more conscious might be, for example, if a child's very upset, or if they want to climb onto our lap for a cuddle, or and I think often when we think about touch, it's the whole hugs and cuddles and kisses that comes to mind. But we forget that there's a lot of touch, just changing a child's nappy. There's ever such a lot of touch that will happen in a positive way. And an definitely appropriate way when you're changing a nappy. So, but often we'll think about, the hugs and cuddles and kind of wonder about that. And we might be naturally concerned about how it could look to somebody else. And so, if I just pick up on that safeguarding thing for a minute, Angelica, because I think it's a genuine concern, and, obviously needs to be thought through. And so, keeping children safe, safeguarding is a top priority that we have, if not the top priority that we have. So that's kind of like the bottom line, isn't it? That's what we have to do. But for me, using sort of touch in a positive and appropriate way with children is actually not at odds with safeguarding, because what I think we need to be conscious of as educators is, everything we're doing is safeguarding our children. It's in our whole practice. So we need to be reflecting upon our practice, thinking about how we might use touch, how we do use touch, perhaps even auditing touch. I suggest in some of my training that educators reflect on when they might use touch and how they'll use it, and really talk about it with each other in detail. So when we're thinking about, for example, that child who climbed into your lap for a story, do they sit on one knee? Do they sit on two knees? Do they sit with their back to you? Do they sit full frontal and cuddle you, leaning right in? Maybe, an educator listening in might think, yeah, that's fine. I'm happy with any of that. Other educators might say, well, actually, I think I'm happy for them to sit on my knee, but a full frontal sort of straddled cuddle, I don't know that I'm so comfortable with that. So I think it's having these conversations in the context of our safeguarding, really. So I would suggest that people think about their policy, their safeguarding policy, and incorporate a loving pedagogy into that, so that they make sure, they're safeguarding themselves, but also safeguarding the children, because obviously it's both, isn't it? So
yeah, and I like that you mentioned that kind of shared reflection, because that's really, really important, and it's not about kind of going too far the other way and thinking we should kind of safeguard children from absolutely everything and almost bubble wrap them. That can often become an issue. And I guess another point of reflection might be the consent kind of issue as well.
Yes.
So, you say what is the educator comfortable with, but actually what is the child comfortable with? So sometimes we may see that a child looks upset or maybe crying, and actually you think, I'm going to give them a hug or a cuddle, but is it what they really want? But also, what is it teaching them? Is it appropriate to just receive a hug from an adult? Actually, if a stranger does that to them, should they have that kind of agency to be able to say no?
Absolutely. So, I mean, my take on sort of consent would be very much that within early childhood, we have to set the tone for life. So teaching children about consent and thinking about the rules around consent from, birth is really, really important. So we need to have those conversations. What is appropriate touch in terms of the children, in terms of child to child, adult to child, and so on. But also, you've sort of brought up who initiates that contact. So, if the child's initiating it, I think that's very different to if the adult's initiating it. But if the adult's responding to a need, I think we can, and they feel that touch might be an appropriate response, we can ask, would you like a cuddle? And the child will either, young children will often demonstrate physically, won't they, how they're feeling. So they'll either kind of literally throw themselves at you for a cuddle, or they'll put their arms up or something. So when we talk about consent with very young children who perhaps can't verbally say that they're consenting, then obviously we're thinking about assent and looking for signs and signals, really. We're looking at body language. We are listening for things that they say, but we're also listening to their behaviour, if that makes sense, and noticing, noticing how they feel about things as well. And respecting, children have the right to say no. So, I think even around things like nappy changing, I think a respectful way to sort of go about nappy changing is actually to say, shall we change your nappy now? And sort of begin asking those questions. If we do have a child that repeatedly says no, clearly we have a duty to change nappies as well. So what we might then do is offer a choice, and we might say, shall we change your nappy before the story or after the story, or something along those lines, so that or would you like me to change your nappy, or would you like Angelica to change your nappy? So that actually not changing the nappy isn't an option.
It's not an option, So it is still giving them that agency and giving them that choice, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just quickly, I wanted to thank all the listeners for tuning into the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Those of you who are regular listeners will know that a new episode comes out every Monday morning, ready for your commute, morning coffee, or that reflective start to the week to get you thinking and in the zone. If you haven't already done so, it would really help this podcast to keep going if you subscribe to the channel that you're listening on. The Voice of Early Childhood podcast can be found on 19 different podcast platforms and on YouTube. So it's highly likely that you, your friends, and colleagues can find it on your favorite streaming platform. So please do hit the subscribe button, and this will help us to keep putting out thought-provoking, reflective, and insightful episodes with a wide range of guests. Thank you. I'll let you get back to the episode now.
But role modelling is really important as well around consent, and something that I know I've only really picked up on in recent years. So when my children were younger, my own children at home, I might have said something like, go and give Grandad a hug goodbye. Okay.
Yeah.
And that would naturally have been something I'd have said to my children when they were young. They're teenagers now, so it's a little while ago. But actually, that probably, well, it wasn't appropriate, really. What I should have said is, would you like to give Grandad a hug goodbye?
Yeah.
Or Grandad would like a hug goodbye. Is that okay? Or, phrasing it more as a question. And then I have to accept, and Grandad has to accept, if the answer is no. And in fact, one of my children is not touchy-feely at all, and she would say no. And so we learned sort of through practice, I suppose, with my daughter, that she's not going to hug people goodbye. Close family, that's fine, actually. So she'll wave, and often her little role is to then stand in the window, and it's become a special thing now that she will stand in the window and wave goodbye. And that's great, because it's sort of given her her own way of sort of saying goodbye without feeling forced to, touch somebody if she doesn't want to, or be touched if she doesn't want to be. So, yeah, it is really important. So I think I said at the beginning, it's getting those, establishing that kind of like ethos of consent from the outset, really. So, yeah. And I'm learning. I'm getting hopefully better at that. But we're all learning all the time.
And that's it, isn't it? It's that lifelong learning kind of culture that you want to really establish in an early childhood setting. So ensuring that leaders do model good practice, but actually if they slip up or someone else slips up, it's okay, and really making that clear that we're all learning. And it is something that is new to a lot of practitioners, because like you say, it's just so natural to be able to say, go and give so and so a hug, because we think, well, actually it has always been harmless, but has it? When we step back and reflect, then we start to think deeper. So that reflection is important, and that almost being kind to ourselves as well, and showing that almost loving pedagogy to each other too.
That's a good point, actually. Thinking about it both ways. So sorry, the other thing I was going to say is about also teaching children to think about asking for consent from each other. So it's not just about consent in terms of adults and children, if that makes sense, but we can also sort of encourage the children to can I play with you? That sort of question as well. And as we're role modeling it, do you want a hug hello, or shall we wave hello today? Or, can I sit beside you and eat my snack? So it's just role modeling it through the daily routine, really. So lots of different opportunities.
And I think what you mentioned earlier about role modeling consent, and also here role modeling consent between children, that's really important to be able to role model when families and parents are around, so then they can pick that up and use it outside of the setting as well. And I just find that those reciprocal relationships and that consistency is so vital, so children, young children especially, are not confused about do they have choice and agency here, are they seen as almost that kind of, in inverted commas, naughty child at home, because they do feel that they have agency because they've learned that in the setting, but actually when they go home, it's almost like it's the other way around to them.
It can sometimes be a bit frowned upon when a child says no, or
exactly.
I had a parent fairly recently, actually, we were talking about consent, and the parent said, well, I don't understand you saying, ask a baby, can I change your nappy, because they're not going to reply. And I kind of said, well, they're not going to reply necessarily because they haven't got that language yet, but just because they're not going to reply, does that mean we're not talking to them? We're not talking, and actually it's the same thing, really. We'll engage in they're sometimes described as proto conversations, aren't they? When you have that sort of before it's a conversation with a very young child, it's still turn taking, it's still reciprocal. It's just not yet in English and full sentences. It might be, and it's the same thing, really. I think it's about getting into habits of doing that, and teaching a child that they are valued and they will be listened to. And so yes, like you say, it affords them agency, doesn't it? I think it's important.
Yeah, definitely. And it makes me think, I know we've mentioned kind of the consent between each child, between children themselves, and asking if they want to play with each other. I think sharing is a big difficult topic here, isn't it? And that's where that consent can really come in. And again, I think parents would really appreciate perhaps even more like training around that, because that's always quite difficult, because they want their child to be polite, I guess, but then they don't necessarily understand.
Sharing's a really funny one, Angelica, because as adults we don't really share much. If you think about it, we have our own everything, from our own pens to our own, and if someone came over and took your phone and said, oh, can I just borrow that for a minute, you'd be horrified. So I think sharing's quite an abstract concept, really, and I think lots of us need training, not just families and parents. I think lots of us need training on what sharing really means. And it's sort of, there are different elements to sharing, because one method of sharing is sort of turn taking. Another method might be playing with something at the same time, or there's just so many different ways that you could share something. And sharing a pizza is very different from sharing a slide in the park. So it's sort of like, it needs a lot of explanation and role modeling, I think, in order for our children to sort of get it. And it's not going to happen naturally, because they're not going to see adults sharing, really. So it's an interesting one.
It's such a good point that you make there. I think I've not really reflected on that so much. As you say, as us as adults, we don't really share that much. Why do we have that expectation of children? It's really interesting. I guess it taps into those maybe power dynamics a little bit, in terms of the adult having that authority and telling the child what to do.
And I think that's where, for me, a loving pedagogy is about trying to equal that out a little bit, so that it's not us and them, and it's not power as in grown up has all the power, child has none. It's much more sort of co-constructed, so we're on a level with the children. Because part and parcel, in a very visual way, of a loving pedagogy would be literally getting down on the floor with the children, greeting them at their level, just like as effective practitioners, that's what we do, isn't it? We're down at the children's level. And I think that's what a loving pedagogy does. It says, that we like you, we love you, we value you, and we want to hear what you have to say, because actually we're sort of learning together on equal terms here. And yes, we have the overview and we have to protect, and there are times when we're needing to be that one in charge, but a lot of the time we can actually be, almost as equal with the children in that sense. So it's important.
That reminds me of kind of the concept of adults modeling it's okay to be sad, perhaps, and maybe even like opening up to children about them not having a good day, perhaps. How do you feel about that? Because again, that's something that needs balance, doesn't it? Because you don't want to kind of open up too much and overshare when a child actually is not ready to to listen to an adult struggling, perhaps. But it's okay to model, and it's good to model that it's okay to be upset about something, and it's how you deal with it.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important that children realise that emotions are not this good or bad thing. Actually, emotions are just emotions, and that we all have emotions. We all feel different things at different times, and that's okay. It's part and parcel of being human. And so yes, we do need to role model that, but we also need to role model how to get over those feelings, or how to cope with those feelings, how to be resilient, how to overcome things. If we're feeling really sad, I know I've said to a child before now, when I feel sad, sometimes I need a cuddle. Do you want a cuddle? You're looking really sad, and then that's sort of a way of sort of sharing your own sort of feelings as well. But I think at the same time, I think acknowledging that you know, I miss my mummy too. I've said many a time to a child in a setting, because actually it's really important, and often that stops them in their tracks and they look at you with big wide eyes and say, oh, you've missed your mummy, because it's like, golly, you know, she's a grown-up and she's missed her mummy. So but I think it is important that children know that all emotions are okay. It's what we do with them. It's the emotion coaching side of things, isn't it? It's what we do with our emotions that may or may not be acceptable. So, you know, it's okay for me to feel really cross because my friend's just taken my toy, but it's not okay to hit my friend when I'm feeling really cross. So, you know, for us to role model how we can respond when we're feeling cross is actually really helpful, because we can show a bit of perhaps control, self-regulation. We can kind of demonstrate that in a positive way to the children, and hopefully help them to learn a little bit of how they could respond next time.
And you mentioned self-regulation there, and I guess it reminds me that physical touch is probably fantastic for co-regulation and supporting children through difficult emotions and calming them down.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing we haven't said yet, though, which is an important point to make, not all children will like to be touched. They won't want to be, you know, and for those children, it can almost do the opposite. So we do need to know our children really well. If we start from the premise of knowing them and knowing whether or not they respond well to touch and want to be touched, and obviously we've talked about consent on that side of things, but in the sense of you know, for a few children, touch could alienate you from them rather than actually help. But in that sense of co-regulating, often you know, if you're having that sort of conversation with a child, gently sort of rubbing their back can be really calming, or holding a hand, or, you know, just sort of just encouraging them out of themselves a little bit by gently touching their arm as you're trying to get their attention. If they're very upset about something over there, and we're sort of down on their level and we're trying to sort of get them out of that situation, gently touching their arm and saying their name and sort of saying, you look very cross. Is everything okay? But sort of finding a way in. But it can also, the touch can help, you know, sometimes. So there can be ways of using touch that can be very supportive to children at different times. So yeah.
Yeah, and I guess, like we say, it is a language, so it's almost like that connection that is formed through touch.
Yes.
Interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
Well, okay, I think we'll leave it there for now, as on this episode we're just focusing mainly on kind of physical touch, and we've addressed a few points, and then perhaps, Tamsin, you might be on again discussing some other kind of aspects of love and pedagogy, because I'm sure there's so much to discuss, but we wouldn't have time to discuss all kind of all love languages in one episode. That would be very long.
Thank you.
So I think short snippets would be best, probably. And then for our listeners, I'll say that our website has Tamsin's article all about tuning into children's love languages, so you can find out more there. And really big thank you, Tamsin, for sharing this space with myself and our listeners. It's fantastic to have you on.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.